When I made my video talking about the strongest IDs in Limbus, I knew that the natural progression of video making meant that talking about the strongest egos in the game was inevitable. And while I definitely have received requests to talk about the best egos to shard, not many of them, or the strongest egos overall, or the most valuable egos for certain archetypes, all of those ideas are plural. And while those video topics are valid, and I might get to them later, it implies I think that there are many ego in the game that deserve equal spotlight as the strongest. Of course, you can probably already tell, in my opinion, that is not the case. So please, give a big round of applause to Fluid Sac, Faust. And while you already knew that ego would be mentioned, the main point of this video is not just simply saying that it's the best. Hell, I could just show the stats on screen and do my normal rundown, and you'd get the general idea. But more so, I want to discuss just how good this ego has been, especially how good it will continue to be, and if its strength is healthy for the game overall. However, we can't discuss any of that without getting into the nitty-gritty of things, and I want to start by contextualizing its release, and then talking about its history throughout the game, and we'll get into the numbers and strict comparisons all throughout this section. Which is to say, Fluid Sac was a launch ego. And yeah, I've already discussed in some past videos about how launch stuff in Limbus is either the equivalent of giving fire to the mortals, or the equivalent of contaminating a soup kitchen with manure. Obviously, Fluid Sac Faust is the former. It was released on the very first Limbus Season's Battle Pass orientation, and although there are other significant outliers in terms of strength, effect, or cost on that same Battle Pass, importantly, none of these other ego were reliable healing ego. Yes, Sinclair's Impending Day exists, but on-kill conditionals are nowhere near reliable, and if you thought for even a second about 4th Match Flame Rodian's ego passive as a healing ego effect, please refrain from speaking to me, as I do not associate with fucking nerds. The point being that your only real options for healing in early Limbus were Pursuance from Rousseau and Fluid Sac from Faust. This immediately gave Fluid Sac Faust an obvious niche, since its 15% max HP heal to all allies was fantastic even in the relatively easy early game of Limbus looking back on it. But as a funny aside, the 15 sanity heal that Fluid Sac also gave was significantly worse, or less effective, during the launch eras of Limbus pre-Refraction Railway 1. Since during this month-long period, 1 sanity did not correlate to plus 1% chance to hit heads, and instead, the chance to hit heads was capped at a roughly 70% chance, meaning using ego and losing sanity was much less impactful since your odds were always worse anyways. Yeah, early Limbus was a mess. And that being said, the days of early Limbus are long gone. That's back when the most amount of sinners we would have on the field was 5, which seems kinda crazy looking back with today's context of basically having access to 12 sinners at your disposal throughout the battle, and always at least 6 on the field. However, there was actually a period of time where having 7 sinners deployed seemed like it was going to be standard. This was during Season 2 of Limbus, Reminiscence, specifically during the MD for that season, the Railway, and the story nodes after a certain point. This is extremely relevant because even though Fluid Sac Faust was already obviously good, I think it was this shift in the amount of sinners allowed in battle, and especially the difficulty of Mirror Dungeon 2 Hard, that solidified Fluid Sac Faust as one of the strongest ego in most situations. The jump in difficulty meant that healing was far more necessary, especially in content where your health was gonna carry over, and 2 more sinners on the field meant that in all aspects, Fluid Sac was gonna be 40% better. Now, in fairness, were you always in desperate need of healing all of your allies for 15% of their max HP? No, and that's never always going to be the case, especially since if you win a clash, you take no damage. So simply win your clashes forever, and you don't actually ever need healing. Well, back then, anyway. So although some of the potential healing output of this ego is theoretical, it's immensely safe to fire off. And more sinners also means more ego resources being generated per turn, even if Gloom was significantly more scarce than it is today. To work around that fact, sometimes suboptimal IDs were used just because they fueled Gloom. and Blue Zippo Lighter and MD2 Hard was highly sought after just to ensure that you could spam Fluid Sac as much as you want. Now, this might lead you to a natural conclusion, that Fluid Sac has actually only gotten worse ever since the decrease in the max center amount from 7 to 6, moving into Season 3, and the generally less difficult MDs since MD2, right? Well, by all means, this was a nerf to its maximum potential effectiveness, but as I just mentioned, you weren't always getting that maximum potential anyways, if ever. And as well, Canto 5 is the time when the sentiment about Fluid Sac being borderline required for some fights was becoming more and more commonplace, all due to a certain beloved mechanic, unavoidable damage. Now, I have talked about this dusty old crone and her motley crew far too many times, and yet somehow she continues to plague my content. Ahab is infamous in Canto 5, alongside Queequeg to a lesser extent, for having counters, which are annoying but not usually devastating, and the Prey Mark phase, which yes, was and still is absolutely terrifying if you don't have a direct counter to it. The PMP is a phase in the Picard Trio fight in Canto 5's dungeon, where you are not allowed to clash against Ahab's attacks for 2 turns so long as Queequeg is alive, and all of those be focused on one sinner. This was the first instance where actual threatening attacks were borderline unclashable, and not just in the sense that they rolled really high, like sometimes in MD2. Now at this point in the Limbus timeline, our healing ego options have expanded a bit, even if some of them are arguably worse than doing nothing, but I won't name names, so it's not like we only had exactly 2 ego to deal with unavoidable damage. And although Pursuance Merceau or Pursuance Rodian can do single target healing better than Fluid Sac Faust, even if they are both a bit janky, and something like Lantern Sinclair is comparable if you don't care about full team healing, Fluid Sac was still the best ego even in this single target situation where it should fall behind other ego. This is because Fluid Sac Faust is not just a healing ego, unlike the other girls. You see, all egos have one downside in common, and that is costing sanity. And in this particular fight, you start with 0 SP. Using Pursuance Merceau or Lantern Sinclair is a fine idea and all, but it means that you lose out on 20 or 25 SP. I already mentioned the 15 SP healing that Fluid Sac provides, but that was at Threadspin 3. And post the July 20th update in 2023, Fluid Sac has the potential to spread 25 SP to all allies on heads hit at Threadspin 4. This meant you could go only 5 sanity negative or 5 sanity positive upon using this, and a usage to start the fight meant you had a serious objective advantage over anyone without Fluid Sac. That's not even all though, since unlike a lot of other ego in the game, Fluid Sac Faust has a great and reliable ego passive, giving the ally with the least HP 2 protection, which was pretty perfect for a fight that could last a lot longer than you'd like if you lack damage, since this lasted for the entire rest of the fight once it was used. This isn't even mentioning how later that same season, Railway 3 brought back this fight, and while sanity wasn't an issue, HP absolutely was. The entire mechanic that allows building up ego resources from previous fights in railways and dungeons definitely led to a lot of these theoretically tough fights being borderline solved once you clicked the "this battle will end in victory" button enough times. Seriously though, why is that the voice line on this ego anyways? It's not even really relevant to the animation or the lore as far as I can tell. Maybe this is a subtle hint by Project Moon that this ego is really good. Truly, brilliant storytelling. But of course, all of that brings us to today, where Fluid Sac Faust is undeniably at its peak in terms of how much value it brings. Yes, even though we don't have 7 sinners on the field anymore, chain battles means that if you just manage to keep your Faust ID alive, you can bring every new ID that comes in as a result of the chain mechanic up to speed in terms of sanity immediately if you want. However, let's be real, if you have Fluid Sac usages to spare, you're probably not dying anyways. Unless, of course, you happen to be fully caught up on in-game content and are at Canto 7. Don't worry, I'm not going to spoil the story, but unbreakable coins are the antithesis of what I mentioned earlier. Normally, winning a clash means you don't take any damage, but unbreakable coins, instead of being cancelled, just set their coin power to 1 and continue anyways, kinda like a counter. Therefore, you are guaranteed to take chip damage from skills that use unbreakable coins, and in Canto 7's case, a lot of those inflict bleed, which is just further unavoidable chip damage. And this is often very spread out across all of your sinners, unlike Ahab. Despite there being plenty of healing ego options in the game at this point, none of them heal your entire team easily, except for one. This means the only real downside to Fluid Sac when it comes to any other healing ego in the game is its relatively high cost of 9 ego resources, except even that doesn't matter anymore. If you have beaten Canto 7, you get access to Superbia, an activatable ability that allows you to use 1 ego for no resource cost. Now, this is a loaded mechanic with lots of potential uses, and sadly it does have limited actual uses, as in you can't just use this every fight. However, I would argue that in at least 80% of fights that you aren't just speedrunning via 1 nuke ego usage, Fluid Sac Faust is just the best option to use on turn 1. It's the exact same philosophy that I mentioned in the Ahab fight. Starting at 0 SP sucks, so why not start with 15 or 25 SP instead, or -5/5 SP in your Faust ID's case. The best part of this ability is that it doesn't have to be turn 1. You can do this whenever, and this also means that your team doesn't even need to fuel Fluid Sac well in order to use it, or well, it doesn't even have to fuel it at all if you only care about using it once. Also, remember what I said before about Gloom being kind of scarce? Well, in modern Limbus, a lot of the best IDs in the game have Gloom. Ringy Sang is the best example of this, since a Gloom skill 1 is the best case scenario for making this work, but there's a ton of examples of IDs that can be used on any team well, released after Canto 5, that make fueling Fluid Sac stupidly easy now. And, well, originally I was going to talk about the downsides of Fluid Sac Faust, like how it costs 9 resources and how that can add up over time, even with Superbia, and how its 24 roll is mediocre. But I realized it's really hard pretending like this ego has some secret to it that makes it bad to use. Funny enough though, there is this odd taboo among some Limbus elitists around using this ego because it is so strong, and honestly, the idea that it ruins any level of difficulty the game could have is not incorrect. Considering the direction Project Moon is clearly trying to go with difficulty, that being unavoidable damage in the hopes of killing your IDs, and that is practically negated by Fluid Sac so long as the damage is both spread across multiple IDs and isn't enough to kill you outright, which is definitely the case with Canto 7, and assumedly, that's gonna keep being the design philosophy moving forward. Just because that's the case, though, doesn't mean you should be annoying to people playing the game using Fluid Sac. That's their choice. But also, is Fluid Sac good for the game? Hell no. In fact, I will state right here, right now, that I firmly believe Fluid Sac is the single biggest mistake PM has ever made from a game design perspective. And that is including the ID that Jihoon himself admitted was an overtuned lapse of judgment. Simply put, nothing can dethrone Fluid Sac, cause it simply does everything. Healing and sanity for the whole team, alongside decent to good AoE damage, is just about everything you could ever hope for. There are egos that do both of these things separately and worse that have been released after Fluid Sac. Bygone Days Ishmael, although it has similar high highs of Pursuance Merceau, is objectively more niche despite also doing things beyond just healing. It is still an ego that costs sanity and therefore has that downside. Yasunyata Heathcliff heals 25 SP to 4 other allies unconditionally, better than Fluid Sac upon hitting tails, but still costs sanity on himself, and heals SP on 2 less allies than what Fluid Sac would give, with the only advantages being that it rolls 2 better than Fluid Sac, costs 1 less, and applies 2 attack power down to up to 5 enemies, which admittedly can be pretty good. It's just a shame that Fluid Sac can also do that. Why? Because of course it can. Have you been paying attention? Look, I know, this corrosion costs more sanity and ego resources, and it's not good to do it, blah blah blah, but ego resource cost can be circumvented via Superbia, and sanity can be regained, funnily enough, through continued usages of Fluid Sac. You know that whole -5 and +5 sanity thing? Yeah, that was me actually portraying Fluid Sac in a worse light than was realistic. Because you can also clash with Fluid Sac for an additional minimum 10 SP recovery, meaning you're left with either 5 or 15 sanity, assuming you started at 0 after using a He level ego. Ridiculous. Really, that's about it. This video was intended to hammer home my points, and I've repeated myself enough, and the conclusion should be pretty clear. Shard this ego if you don't have it. There's no shame in it, and it's probably the single best investment you can make in this game. Even an ID, like Ring Yi Sang, has the potential to be topped in terms of damage or versatility. However, I really doubt that PM will ever make another ego like Fluid Sac, which, in a weird way, is kind of a shame, since owning Fluid Sac invalidates a lot of other healing and SP healing options, unless you just need a healing ego that isn't on Faust specifically. Are there arguments for some other ego being stronger in terms of damage or some kind of other odd utility? Yeah, sure. But for the general player base, it's not close. Now, will Project Moon ever do anything about how strong this ego is? Well, they can't nerf it, which I wouldn't want anyways, but I do think that there should be some content that is optional, and maybe limits your egos or IDs to make it so you cannot just Fluid Sac your way through the game. It's really the only way I can think of to discourage usage of it that wouldn't feel unfair, like a one-shot skill that specifically targets Faust, but maybe we'll get to that in Canto 12. Personally, I have a weird relationship with this ego because, well, it's really good, and that's fun. Reflecting on my experience playing Limbus, I have absolutely had way more fun when I did not allow this ego. Unfortunately, that is just the nature of the game being too simple if you have a win button. And that's why, despite being really good, Fluid Sac is a design abomination, nabbing a well-earned spot among the other problem children in Limbus Company. But that's all from me. This is a video where I'm especially curious to know people's thoughts, whether you agree with me on the severity of Fluid Sac's crimes or not, but either way, thank you for watching. And speaking about you commenting on the video, you may have heard of this new AI feature that YouTube has, where it tries to steal creators' personalities and creates auto-generated responses that are meant to be similar enough to the creator to be used. I think. I don't know why anyone would genuinely use these, since they are terrible. Like, look at this shit. No human would ever say that. So I'm gonna use them. For the first 24-ish hours, or however long I decide, I will respond to every comment that gives one of these auto-generated replies with one of the two options. Only you people who stay to the end of the video will know why I am acting so strange in the comment section, but it's up to you to either tell people or don't tell people, and bait the AI ESGOO into maybe saying something funny. On screen now are some of my personal favorites just from the past few videos. Okay, seriously this time, I'm starting to run out of breath underwater here. Thanks for watching, and this